We begin with U.S. Congressman Mike Pence of Indiana. He's chairman of the House Republican Conference, one of the leaders of the House. You know, I have to ask you, sir, what is it, you know, Steve Schmidt, who ran John McCain's campaign for president last year, was pretty honest recently in the diagnosis in the postmortem, and he said the Barack Obama for president campaign was really a continuation of the Bobby Kennedy campaign back in the 60s. It had all the passion of the anti-war movement. My question to you, sir, what gives passion to Republicans these days? What turns them on the way fighting the Iraq war, against the Iraq war, has done for Democrats?
Well, I think that returning our government to some fiscal sanity, putting an end to this long train of borrowing and spending and bailouts is what turned out, you know, hundreds of thousands of people at tea parties, Chris.
Yeah.
And I really do believe that a return to fiscal discipline, to turning our federal government back toward that lodestar of a balanced federal budget, making the kind of hard choices in Washington, D.C. that every American family and every American business and family farmer is making, I think that's a rallying cry that I'm hearing across Indiana and across this country.
But who believes that? Because under George W. Bush, we doubled the national debt. If you want to get back to the lodestar of balanced budgets, you got to go back to Bill Clinton. He's the last guy to balance the budget. Do you want to get back to Clinton?
Well, it's a fair point that the last Congress to balance federal budget was the Republican Congress under President Clinton. And it's a fair comment. Look, the criticisms of runaway federal spending certainly extend back into the Bush years. As you know, Chris, I was one of the harshest critics of big government republicanism during the Bush era. But, you know, you asked the question not about, you know, Republicans in Washington, but people across this country who, by and large, generally will vote Republican or are interested in Republican values. I think the key to winning back the hearts and minds of those millions of Americans is to turn our party back to a practiced, real commitment to fiscal discipline and limited government. We marry that with a strong commitment to national defense and an unapologetic commitment to traditional moral values. And I think we'll have the agenda that we can carry forward into the future.
What do you think of these polls that show that only 1 in 5 people today, men and women, 1 out of 5 say they're a Republican? 1 out of 5? I've never seen either political party dip that low. Have you?
Well, I don't know. I don't really have much of memory for polling numbers.
You'd remember that, baby.
Well, you know, that's a fair point.
1 in 5?
You know, it does sound to me a little bit like the number of Americans who said they were Republicans before a Californian named Ronald Reagan came into the White House. I think when Ronald Reagan became president, about 20% of Americans said they were Republicans. When he left office, he had doubled the size of the party. Why? Because Ronald Reagan arrives in Washington, D.C. with a strong commitment to a national defense, with a commitment to balanced budgets and fiscal discipline. It's tough in a Democratic Congress, you might remember, and also with an unapologetic commitment to traditional moral values. That combination of American ideals put into practice, not just talked about, was the prescription then. I'll be honest with you, I believe it's still the prescription today, Chris.
You know what about Reagan? I was there because he knocked our socks off. I was working for the other guy, and he was damn good because he stood there in front of the Statue of Liberty, or rather the Statue of Liberty, actually, in New Jersey, out on that plane, in that regular shirt he was wearing, and I'll never forget it. And he talked about American patriotism. He was passionate. He was a romantic about American life. Do you have anybody in your party that can arouse those passions of positive love of country the way Reagan could? I mean, he was bigger than just complaining about high taxes. He was an American hero. You got one now.
Well, let me say there's an awful lot of talented men and women in this party across the country, but let me say with authority, I know we had one until this last Saturday night. You know, when I became a Republican, I started out as a Democrat, Chris. It may come as a surprise to you in my early political years, but when I heard the voice of Ronald Reagan and when I saw the example and heard the voice of Jack Kemp, that's when I became a Republican. And, you know, that was a tremendous loss to our party. But as we think about how we find our way forward, I got to tell you, Jack Kemp's large-hearted conservatism, his belief in free market entrepreneurial capitalism, his commitment to equality of opportunity for all Americans, his commitment to traditional values, we go looking for a role model for a 21st century GOP. Jack Kemp is my pick.
The only problem is he talked about the big tent, but he didn't get too far. Let's take a look at, and I like Jack Kemp. Here, let's take a look at his verbal shot today from Jim Bunning, the senator from Kentucky, against his fellow senator from Kentucky and fellow Republican Mitch McConnell. Quote, "Do you realize that under our dynamic leadership of our leader, we have gone from 55 senators to probably 40 in 2 election cycles. And if the tea leaves that I read are correct, we'll end up with about 36 after this election cycle. So if leadership means anything, it means you don't lose approximately 19 seats in 3 elections with good leadership." There you have 2 people from the same state, both Republican U.S. senators, one whacking the other one. Is that trouble for your party when you have that kind of discord?
Well, you got to remember, I grew up in southern Indiana, and so seeing sharp elbows across the Ohio River down in Kentucky is not a new thing to me. Look, I don't want to get in between those 2 senators in that argument. I really do believe the way back for the Republican Party is to renew and practice our commitment to fiscal discipline, like opposing the stimulus bill, opposing the president's recent budget bill, and opposing the national energy tax in the cap and trade legislation that's going to result in higher utility rates on virtually every American. We get back to defending the interest of taxpayers, of utility rate payers. We get back to defending the interest of the American people. The American people will rally to our side.
You know, the Democrats have a lot of people who are passionate about climate change, people like Al Gore, and they'll go out there and fight for it. They'll campaign for it. Young people especially really care about green stuff. My wife's a big green person. But Republicans aren't known for being green. Your party's come up with this alternative, but nobody really believes you got any passion on this subject. If there's any passion on this subject, it's Limbaugh. It's people like Glenn Beck, who don't believe in climate change. It's people like Jim Imhoff, who don't believe it. How can your party be credible on dealing with CO2 emissions, with greenhouse gases, when the loudest voices in your party don't believe in it? They just don't believe in it.
Well, let me tell you, and I think the science is very mixed on the subject of global warming.
Okay, well, then how can you get excited about it? Then why should your party believe you're going to get serious about it if you say the science is mixed?
Yeah, it's a fair question. But look, I'm all for clean air. I'm all for clean coal technology. I'm sure reducing CO2 emissions to be a positive thing. You're going to see Republicans, like at our energy summit today, you're going to see us oppose this massive national energy tax in the cap and trade. But you're also, Chris, going to see Republicans come out with an all-of-the-above strategy, more opportunities to explore our own domestic reserves, oil, natural gas, and coal, clean technologies, fuel efficiency standards, conservation, wind, solar, nuclear. We call it an all-of-the-above strategy, and you just wait and see. We're going to go all across the country with these energy summits, hear from the American people, and we're going to educate the American people on a 21st century Republican agenda for the environment.
You want to educate the American people about science and its relevance today. Do you believe in evolution, sir?